Um, may I suggest that first we introduce ourselves? Who are you?
I guess I can start. Hi, my name is SL Huang, and I am primarily a writer. I am the author of the Cass Russell series from Tor Books, which are sci-fi thrillers about an anti-heroine who can do math really, really fast and uses it to kill a lot of people. And I also have an upcoming fantasy, Burning Roses, also from Tor. And I also used to work in movies, which is relevant to this panel. I was a stunt person and weapons expert, so I was on the cast and crew side. I wasn't on the, but now as a writer, I'm working on the IP side of, my own IP is being licensed for movies. So I'm seeing it from that direction as well. And I've also done a little bit of game writing. And on the fandom side, I've been in fandom a very long time and love fan fiction and remix culture. And so I'm very like in the weeds on adaptation stuff, and I've done a little bit of work on other people's IP as a writer as well. There's so many nuances to this, and I'm really excited to talk about it.
I'll go. Hi, I'm Rebecca Slit. I am an editor and partner at Choice of Games. In that capacity, I have edited a few games that are literary adaptations. So I will be talking about that, I'm sure, in the course of the panel. I've also done work on several live action and tabletop role-playing games. So writing for other people's IP and helping to build out an already established world. And I am also in fandom culture and writing and reading fanfic and loving that side of fandom, just engaging in it so deeply that you want to try to make it your own.
Is it my turn?
It is.
I talk? Oh dear. So hi, I'm Sislyn Smith. I primarily write short stories and also poetry. I play a lot of games and I voraciously read things, all the things, everywhere, give them to me. I'm on this panel mostly because the things that I like to write tend to be kind of remixy or adapty. I have been playing with fairy tales and everything that goes into them since I was like this big. And a lot of my stories end up being fairy tale retellings. So that's me. Hi.
Awesome, thank you. Our first audience question is about adapting Our first audience question is from Eponessa. Can you tell us about the process of adapting your own IP to TV or film versus adapting someone else's? And let's start with Sislyn and go back through Rebecca.
So I have no experience in this area at all, so I'm going to pass it on.
Yeah. SL, this is all you.
All right, I got this.
It's you.
Okay, so the process of when, as a writer, when my IP is licensed to a film studio, it's actually kind of rare that the writer has any control over it from that point. I mean, it really depends on the studio, the producers. Very rarely can you get something contracted in where you're like able to have control over the adaptation of your own work. That's, the JK Rowlings can do that, but not, little old us. But there are sort of soft ways that can happen, like through my agent or through just my relationship with the production house, where my production house for one of my pieces, they're always, they've been, I don't know what's happening now with the pandemic, but they've continually been sending me like updates and like, oh, this is what we're planning for it, and I'm invited to give feedback. I don't know how seriously they would take it if I said like, oh no, everything they've sent me has been fantastic, but if I did have an objection or wanted more input, I don't know how that would go. But generally it's out of my hands. My film agent is pitching me as a writer on my own IP, so that whereas I would be helping to write the screenplay or on the team as a writer, but again, it wouldn't really be mine at that point. It would be part of a team that is subject to the vagaries of so many other things. One thing I know from working in movies for so long, and I have a very like a visceral understanding of this, is so many voices go into a film production, all up until the time of filming, and then even through filming, and then editing afterwards and promotion. Everything gets changed a million times. There'll be like, 7 producers and they each want their say, or the network has to have its say. And then, they're trying to license for certain countries and things have to get changed. And the actors come in and put their own stamp on it and they say, no, I really want the character to sound more this way, which I think is actually great, because one of the things as an adaptation, one of the valuable things of an adaptation is getting those other perspectives, putting their own spin on it. So even though with like a million network executives, sometimes it can bog down when it comes to like screenwriter, director, actors, and all of those people putting their own creative skill into it. I don't think that's a drawback, just to be clear. I think that's amazing. But no, as the author, I become a very small and or non-existent part of that. And then there was another part of this question, which was, I will just look back at the chat. Oh, adapting your own IP to film versus adapting someone else's. So adapting someone else's, it's sort of the flip side of the coin, where everything it depends. There are a few different ways you can write something for film. For example, I've been asked to do some work for hire things, which would be where I don't own any of it. I'm basically just it's like writing a tie-in novel, where I would be writing the screenplay for that IP according to their strictures, and I would just be the writer. I would have a very narrow prescription beyond that. Versus if I were a screenplay writer, and that were, a big part of my career, where I was taking somebody else's book, for example, and writing that. I don't know as much about that process, but I think it would be sort of the same type of world, but like a slightly different role than sort of what I was just describing, where you're answering to the production house and everybody like that. But then also I would hope, maybe working with the writer a little bit, as the production houses and the writers they're hiring are working with me right now.
Thank you. That's very helpful, and that clarifies a lot. We have another question from Jordan, who wants to know how far from a source material, such as a fairy tale, which both Jordan and Sislyn like to work with, can you go while still referring to it as an adaptation or retelling? When does that retelling become not a retelling, but more like an inspired by tale, if at all?
So I tend to say that if the core story is still recognizable, then it's a retelling. Like, there are lots and lots of retellings and adaptations of Peter Pan out there, and you can tell that they're retellings and adaptations of Peter Pan because you've got The Boy Who Never Ages, and you've got Neverland, and you've got these core components that make up like the backbone of the world and the story. And I think if those are present and recognizable to you and to your audience, and like that might be the even more critical component there, then it's still an adaptation. Like, when you get into inspired by is when you've been dreaming about like the Goose Girl for so long, and the Goose Girl is stuck in your head, and you've just been thinking so much about her life, and you've, instead of her going off and becoming the Goose Girl, she goes on adventures with Falada and never meets her betraying maid, then that is inspired by. Like, that's how I would do that.
But what do we think about The Lion King? Is that an adaptation or inspired by Hamlet?
Inspired by.
I would say like the first act is an adaptation and the second act is inspired by.
Yeah,
well put.
Yeah, I mean, the longer The Lion King goes on, the harder you have to squint to see how it's actually an adaptation. But I think that tracing that sort of narrative genealogy back can be really valuable to understand where an author or screenwriter is coming from and what they are responding to, and how they use the source material can be really valuable to understand as well. Do they want to keep the plot? Do they keep the original plot but push back against it in some way? Or, in the case of Lion King, have an original plot, but understand that for their target audience, not all of it is going to work. So they have to make some really key changes.
I agree with Rebecca and Sislyn, pretty much everything you guys said. I would say that I call something based on when I feel like the people who love the source material, because I don't, I also remix a lot of fairy tales like Sislyn does. In fact, my book Burning Roses that I mentioned is a remix of a whole bunch of both Chinese and Western mythologies and folktales. And when I am writing a remix like that, I'm doing it because I love the source material. I love playing with it. I love turning it on its head, and I'm having a good time with this stuff that's a touchstone for me. And if I feel like other people will also have that feeling reading it, that's when I call it, an adaptation, or based on, if I feel like I'm just sort of using this structure, maybe like, West Side Story versus Romeo and Juliet might be an example of that, where I feel like it's got the structure of Romeo and Juliet. I don't know if like there are big Romeo and Juliet stans who like watch all the adaptations, but like I don't know that they would watch it and be like, oh yeah, I'm getting out of this the touchstone that play is for me. So I feel like that might be more inspired by, but at some point probably if there's a publisher or distributor, they would make that call regardless of what we think and just like put it on the marketing material.
Right. Yeah. Sort of the flip side of what you were saying about the so many people's hands going into a film adaptation, whether something is called inspired by or based on could come down to, what an intern felt that day. Like
very much. Yeah. Or if it's a Jane Austen, they know if they put Pride and Prejudice, like a whole bunch of people will like flock to that. So
right. So even if it's relatively far away, it's really, really to the publisher's advantage to call it as close to Pride and Prejudice as possible. And there's actually this like wonderful micro genre of Pride and Prejudice adaptations, and I love it, and I love seeing what people do with it.
It's such a good book. I love it so much. And my favorite adaptation is the Lizzie Bennet Diaries. I don't know if you all have seen that.
So much. Yes.
I'm putting it on my to read pile.
Yes, to watch. It is a yes, it's a YouTube adaptation. Lizzie Bennet is a grad student in communications doing a video diary as her master's thesis project.
That sounds brilliant.
So good.
And I want it in my face. So.
You like don't start watching it until you have like the entire afternoon to like watch all the episodes, because there are 100 episodes. It's extremely well produced, and it's so addicting. Like you feel like these are real people, and I'm like, oh my gosh, what's gonna happen? Even though I know the whole story of Pride and Prejudice, I'm like, but her sister, and how is this going to resolve? It's really great.
And even cooler is it has spin-offs and there's a transmedia component. Like all of the characters, the writing staff gave the characters Twitter accounts, and so the characters would be tweeting at each other. And at one point, Lydia gets mad at Lizzie and starts her own video diary.
Oh my God. This sounds great, and I now know what I'm going to be doing to decompress after the con.
so good. And they also did Emma. Emma approved. Emma's a lifestyle expert, and Harriet is her assistant.
And then they did spin-off books of those, but I recommend watching the YouTube series first. It's their main thing. It looks like, do we have a moderator? Is this?
I've arrived. Yes. Sorry.
Hello.
It worked fine yesterday or Thursday, I guess it was, and then today was. Now it's working again. And I came in the middle of a good part because yes, Lizzie Bennet Diaries. My wife is a huge Jane Austen fan. Watches any and everything, even the bad adaptations she's seen. And she watched that and she was like, "You have to watch this." And I was like, "Really?" And yeah, you have to watch it. It's really good. I'm trying to. My mom's a huge Jane Austen fan. I've been trying to get her to watch it, but it's a little bit. She's like pushing 80, so it might be a little bit. But it's Pride and Prejudice though, so it shouldn't be that hard of a sell. But I think I would have to like kind of like be there and be like, "Here, let me show you how you watch this thing."
Yeah. Cue it up for
right.
this.
All right. So I don't know what all you've covered, but Um,
we just introduced ourselves and then chatted.
okay. Good. I'm
Too far. Can you change your name?
Lexi. Oh, yeah. I forgot to do that.
Sorry.
I will. Yes. No. Good call.
I'm Tiffany. I'm your
You
facilitator,
don't believe
and
my
if you want, I
real
will.
name is presenter.
I'm having some audio trouble
I was
with
just about to
Alexei.
ask you. That was just me.
No, it's not just you. Okay.
Sorry. Alexei, yeah, you were having connection problems.
We can't hear you at all.
Can't type today.
I heard something.
There you go.
I see in the chat, looks like I've been muted.
I took care of that already.
This was happening before.
There you go.
Okay.
Now we can hear you. Yay.
That's old.
Okay.
We got you back.
You're still a little bit laggy.
Good. Okay.
But
Maybe it's an off and on issue. Oh, okay.
maybe.
Good.
Before we get started, I just want to
I reset my router before. That's why I was late. But
do you want me to put questions from Discord into the chat here, or how would you like to do this?
I was thinking to save them to the end. That was going to be what I was gonna do.
Excellent.
If that's agreeable with others.
Of course, I'll give you a 10-15-minute warning.
Okay. Sounds good. So I guess everyone's already introduced themselves. I'll introduce myself. I'm Alexi, Alex, whatever you want. Was supposed to be moderating this panel, so I will start doing that now. So I guess just briefly, anybody want to mention? I'm sure you've mentioned them already, but one or two pieces of adaptation media that you find particularly good or effective, and why. And if you just want to say, oh, we just talked about that, that's a fine answer as well.
I think we could infinite numbers of these. Like, we will not run out of recommendations.
It's true.
Okay. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I always blank when I'm asked these like favorite questions, but Lizzie Bennet Diaries is definitely one of the number ones, and pretty much everything that they put out.
Am I having audio issues again?
Oh, are we?
We're.
Can you hear us? Okay.
Okay.
And I'm a big fan of Shakespeare adaptations, which there have been umpteen. I'm trying to like think of a favorite. I mentioned West Side Story, which is one of my absolute favorites also. But I'm trying to think of some maybe more obscure ones that people might not know. There's one coming out soon that I want to say, or maybe just came out, that I want to say is Henry V, and I can't remember the title, but it's genre. It's like science fiction fantasy, and it looks so good. And I'm completely blanking out. I'll see if I can look it up and put it in the Discord because I want to signal boost it. I love stuff like that. I also love Journey to the West adaptations. For those who don't know, Journey to the West is one of the 4 classical Chinese novels. And it stars the Monkey King, whom you may have also heard of, and has been adapted zillions of times, including Dragon Ball Z is a very, very loose adaptation of Journey to the West. So that's what I'll throw out there. There are so many good ones where you like look at it and you might not even know it's an adaptation until you dig and you're like, oh, there was source material. Another adaptation, I think it's not far from the source material, but it's such a good, well-written adaptation, and the art of adaptation is The Shawshank Redemption, which is just one of my favorites of like, because I read the short story after I saw the movie, and honestly, I think the movie is better, and the choices they made in adapting that, I can see, I'm like, oh, that was such a good choice to make this an adaptation. So I'll stop there. I could keep going.
I missed the title on that last one. What did you say?
Sorry, what the title on which one?
The last one you were just talking about.
The Shawshank Redemption.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
I'm still having a little audio trouble hearing you, but continue.
Okay.
Yeah. If, Rebecca, you want to go?
Yeah. So I actually I did a lot of thinking about this ahead of time, and I actually had a Shakespeare near the top of my mind too. One recent Shakespeare adaptation that I really like is Elsinore, the video game. It is a video game adaptation of Hamlet. You are Ophelia, and you are caught in a time loop. You are trying to prevent everybody from dying horribly. And it's brilliant.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, it is a brilliant game, really well designed, doing really cool things with, adapting and updating characters. But one of the things I love about it is the way it treats its expectations of the audience's knowledge of the source material. Like, if you already know the plot of Hamlet inside out, then that's fine. After the first run through, Ophelia does too. And if you don't, that's okay, because after the first run through, Ophelia does too. And if you already know the source material really well, then you can pay attention to seeing the little Easter eggs in the adaptation, like, oh, what did they do with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern? And oh, there's, a chunk of dialogue from the original just dropped right in. And if you don't, then the story is still really fun and engaging and a good game, as well as a good Hamlet adaptation. I have many others, but I will leave it there.
Okay, so I did not have a lot of time to think about this question, but I do have good answers anyway. So if you have not picked up To Be or Not to Be by Ryan North or Romeo and or Juliet, they are both amazing. They are choose your own path style books through the Shakespeare versions, and they are brilliant. Juliet is a bodybuilder. You can play as the ghost. Like, these are books, but I think they actually have been adapted into games too, like actual games that you can play on your computer. I don't have a link to that or anything, but you can look them up. Ryan North is brilliant and they are amazing. And all of the original choices are marked and always lead you to bad endings. So you can do what the characters did, and it's tragic because it's Shakespeare, or you can find out what it's like to be a ghost under
That's
the
amazing.
ocean. So those are both amazing. I also what I was gonna call out Shawshank, rar, because it's really brilliant. It's incredibly well done. And something that's not quite an adaptation, but which picks and chooses from so many different source materials, and you don't realize it until you're kind of deep in, is Gargoyles. Yes, the cartoon.
I've heard that it does that really well. I've never seen it, but yeah.
It really does, and it's really worth watching. It is an amazing cartoon, and if you grew up on Star Trek TNG like I did, it's a little disconcerting because so many of the actors from that are voicing characters, and it's like, Worf is what? But no, just stick with it. And the plot is great. There are very few actual filler episodes, and they're all short anyway, and it's just incredibly well produced, and I love it. And it just grabs from Arthurian myth and Shakespeare and just everywhere and plays with it in a way that I find incredibly delightful. So those are my picks.
All right, great. I kind of forgot what mine were. I was going to mention "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" In part because when I went into the theater to watch it, I had absolutely no idea that it was based on the Odyssey, and I was kind of confused when I found out. But then I was like, oh wait, that makes sense. So that's kind of my taste, is like really kind of like taking the source material and doing something really like unexpected with it is actually kind of what I prefer for adaptations. I know some people prefer kind of a little more, I'm blanking on words here, true to the original. But yeah, I'm drawing a blank on any of the other ones that I wanted to mention, unfortunately. But I'm the moderator, so I don't really have to answer these questions. I can just make you answer them.
Sounds
So,
good.
So what's something you like to see in an adaptation that you think it's an element of an adaptation that you particularly like to see, but you think it gets kind of overlooked by fans and creators? Like maybe when you see it, people don't notice it, or when you don't see it, you're kind of like, oh, I wish they'd done that. Just something that gets kind of overlooked, maybe a less common little kind of Easter egg kind of element of adaptations. So, Sislyn, are you talking?
Oh, Sislyn,
Sislyn, I can't hear you.
No.
It doesn't look like you're muted.
Okay.
Can you
Somebody
hear
else
me
wanna
now?
Yes.
jump in?
Okay, I'm sorry about that. So one of my absolute favorite things that I love in an adaptation is a re-examination of motivation. So often, like they'll just lift the characters and just set them on the path in a new world, basically. It's like a whole different scenario, but the same people. And they don't re-examine the motivations of the characters. And they end up doing things that just really baffle me and it frustrates me. But when it's done well, I love it and it makes me very happy. So that's one of my favorite things.
Yeah. One thing that I have a weird appreciation for, especially in adaptations from book to screen, is combining characters. Where, you know, in a book, you can keep track of many more characters in an ensemble cast. For a TV or film adaptation, A, the audience can't do that as easily, and B, you can't pay as many actors. So I really appreciate when an adaptation will, you know, for instance, take a storyline that was originally played out by a minor character and give it to a major one, or combine a couple into someone. And I wish I had a really good example of this right now. Oh, actually, Outlander. I'm not watching it anymore, but before I noped out, there in like season 4 or 5, there's this obscure political conflict called the Regulators. And in the book, it was enacted by a whole bunch of brand new characters who we just met. In the actual show, they brought back a character we already knew. I'm not going to say who in case of spoilers, but they brought back a character who the audience already knew and had already been a fan favorite. And they made him a key player in that plot. So all of a sudden, the audience is super invested in this conflict that very few people had heard of outside the context of the book or the show, because this person who they already care about is invested in it. So, you know, even though I have a whole slew of problems with books and show, that was a really smart choice.
I really agree with that. Like combining and splitting characters. I'm just like nodding along with everything you're saying there.
Yeah.
I'm going to mention something that I don't think it's actually that overlooked anymore, but I think we could keep going deeper and deeper in it. Is things like gender flipping, race flipping, queer flipping. Is that what we would call it? You know, some of these characters from, especially from older media, or maybe media where there's an assumed default of what these characters look like. Also things like disability status, and you know, any of these various identities that we now talk about a lot and needing representation for. And we don't necessarily see them represented in some of these older classic touchstone properties that are fodder for a lot of adaptations. The Lizzie Bennet Diaries is again a great example of this, where like Charles Bingley became Bing Lee in the adaptation. They made him Asian, and of course his sister Caroline also then became Asian. They did this with a lot of the characters. That's just one example. You know, it really it matters a lot. The book I have coming out this year is from a universe where I'd written some short stories, and the first time one of the short stories came out, I was taking Western fairy tales and looking at the, like, making them sort of fantasy Chinese and changing a lot of these characters so that they're interacting with, like, bridging cultures in a way that was important to me as somebody who's Chinese American and grew up in America, but also, like, was having this feeling like I wasn't quite fitting in with the Western fairy tales, even though that was my upbringing. And I got so many messages from people saying, thanks for making me feel like these fairy tales belong to me as well. And it was like Beauty and the Beast and Red Riding Hood. And thank you for making me feel like I have a place in that world, that these doors are open to me. So I think that does really matter and continues to matter, because so many of these archetypes are so large in our culture and perhaps haven't been imagined in ways that a lot of people can see themselves in before.
Okay, great. Mine seems kind of lame now. I was thinking kind of along the lines of, when I thought of this question, I was thinking of, this is particularly among fans of, I feel like it gets overlooked when somebody does a really good job of adapting something in such a way where you don't have to know anything about the source material. I actually really appreciate that. Even if I love the source material, I'll be watching like, wow, they did a really good job of introducing that character, and just a lot of, I think, obviously people who work on adaptations have appreciation for this, but you know, moving especially from like a literary to like graphic novel or film adaptation or something like that, the visual medium like just changes a lot of things. And when they do a really good job of, you know, it's like, oh well, this scene in the book, it's like all in the character's head, and they have to figure something out completely different. Like actually, I think one of the things I was thinking of was when I went to go see the Hunger Games movie, just the first one in the theater. I was like, man, how are they going to do that? Because it's just so viscerally inside of, you know, Katniss's head the whole time, and they did a good job, I felt like, of telling that story in a different way. Like they didn't try to deep dive into her head, and because you couldn't really do that in film in an effective way, and so they instead did. They worked with a lot of very, you know, vivid visual imagery, and the later movies I wasn't as keen on, but I thought they did a really good job with that first one. Let's see. So missteps or pitfalls that you maybe think sometimes might cause an adaptation to flounder or fail for you?
I think I've got a couple, and they're sort of intertwined with each other. Trying to get everything in and not understanding the medium you're translating from to. Like, I'm sure we all have like a ton of book adaptations that we can think of where the movie or the TV show just hits every single scene of the book and it doesn't work. So yeah, I think that is one really common one.
Those are my big ones as well.
Yeah.
I think what's more important in an adaptation,
kind of the converse of what I was saying.
Yeah.
What's more important in an adaptation, in my opinion, is then the faithful blow by blow of literally representing everything, is capturing the spirit of what you're adapting. Because some of those properties that you're talking about, Rebecca, where they hit every scene, somehow they lose the spirit and humor of it. And it's I'm thinking in particular of humor, but whatever other thing drew people to the piece in the first place, and you're like, wow, that's, you know, that's not the thing I love.
I think mine would be adding kissing parts for no reason. Like,
yes,
just, and now there's a romance subplot with these guys and now they're gonna kiss. Like, no, especially because it's usually gratuitously heterosexual. Like,
I heard somebody had the most wonderful phrase, compulsory heterosexuality. Like, look,
yeah,
that character is a man and that character is a woman. They must smooch. It is
yes.
It is like, really,
you can predict the smooching. The smooching shall happen, and I'm just, I like smooching. It's okay, but like, not everything has to have the smooching.
And
I get pretty tired.
Yeah, and sometimes if it's an old property with like one female character, then suddenly they've made, or only a few female characters, suddenly they're all love interests, and it totally changes the dynamic.
Yeah,
Totally.
That's my, yeah.
One of the things I really appreciated about I watched a few seasons of Elementary, the Holmes adaptation, and one of the things I really appreciated was there was no romantic interaction between Sherlock and Joan Watson. Their relationship was completely platonic, and I thought they did a good job of that. And I thought it was a really good choice, actually. Because like it's just so frequent that like you have a male and female character. Well, obviously, yeah, that they must have smooching, as you say. Okay. So I think we've kind of already covered this one, which was, kind of, I think maybe implicated in the description of the panel was that should adaptations, adhere closely to the source material, or is there something to be said for diverging from the original? I think most of us seem like we come down on the side of kind of go where the story takes you. But does anybody else have anything? I'm sure you have things to add, but yeah, go ahead.
I think what Rebecca said about being mindful of medium is so important. And because what works for a book doesn't necessarily work for film, or I'm sure for games. And it's keeping that in mind and knowing those narrative choices and making it work for the new medium. I think is a really important part of that.
And I think diverging from the original is also a valuable way to respond to it. One of the other things I was thinking about in preparing for this panel was the game 80 Days, which is an adaptation of Around the World in 80 Days. And like, you are Passepartout and you're hanging out with Phileas Fogg and you are going around the world in 80 days. But unlike the original, you are actually engaging with 19th century colonialism and the actual diversity of the world. And the writers of the game have talked very openly and in great detail about the reasons that they did that and the very good reasons that they had for needing to respond to the original. And in doing so, they created some really wonderful stories.
I think it's really important for creators when they're adapting or remixing to give themselves permission to play. Like, you're playing, play. Like, go ahead. It's not that, oh, the Lost Boys all have to be boys, because no, they don't. It's fine. They can if you want, but you have the power.
Yeah.
I do think so. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I do think sometimes when we're remixing too, we're responding sometimes to something in the piece that is uncomfortable for us or that we want to react to, and not necessarily like correct, but to make a response in culture. And that could be something problematic, or it could even be something like taking some minor characters and giving them a voice, something like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which is another one of my favorite Shakespeare remixes, where you take these minor characters and suddenly the whole story is about them. And that's another really fun way of remixing that might not look like the original at all. Or the Harry Potter musical is another one that like looks nothing like the original, but is so fun. And you can tell what they were going for there, and they totally succeed. So yeah, there are all different ways as well. You're not necessarily doing a literal adaptation every time. You might be doing a remix or working from another property.
Yeah, and that ties into what I was going to say, which is that's a liberating thing about fanfic. From all of those angles, like you can just change something and see if it works. And sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it doesn't, and that's okay. But it also frees you to, turn the story around. What does this story look like from the perspective of this minor character? How are they affected by, what Harry and Ron and Hermione are doing?
Okay, probably want to move to questions. I guess maybe real quick, if everybody wants to in the description, does a bad adaptation ruin the original? If people want to weigh in on that real quick. No?
Sorry, Sislyn, were you going to say something?
Just shake my head, no. Like, I have opinions. That's my opinion.
The original still exists.
Yeah.
I was more sensitive to this when I was younger. When I was a kid, I never wanted to see the movies and books because then those characters I would see in my mind's eye, and I was really attached to like my visuals. But that's sort of stopped happening. So even if it's a bad adaptation, I'm sort of, like you're saying, able to let it go and say, I don't know, that's okay. It's not for me, but I still love this.
Yeah.
I do get mad though when they do things like, when they whitewashed Avatar: The Last Airbender, or stuff like that. Like I really get mad at the lost opportunity there. Not so much that it's ruined the original, because it hasn't. Last Airbender, the cartoon, is still amazing. But the all that, like the lost chance to have something awesome, I get upset about.
Yeah.
All right. And if Tiffany, our wonderful organizer, do you have any questions you would like to feed us, or I can try to go back through the Discord and take a look?
I'll go ahead and send some questions into the chat.
Okay. Let me begin it so I can see. So this is from Jordan. Do you consider whether your audience has knowledge of the source story or not when making a remix or adaptation? Do you think it matters to your readers that if your readers have heard or never heard of the source? I mean, I think it's going to create a different experience depending on how they've engaged with source material in the past, if at all. And I think one should be mindful of that. What do others have to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, when you're writing for the general public, I think you have to take into account all possible levels of knowledge of the source material. You have to consider that this may be the first time somebody has ever engaged with it, or they could know and love the original, or they could know and hate the original. So yeah, just sort of hold all of those in your mind and understand that your audience may be coming from any one of those perspectives.
I'm going to add a twist here that we talk about a lot in communities where either we or our parents come from countries that aren't the US, or from cultures that aren't perhaps the dominant culture, which is a lot of times we do want to remix something from our culture that we know a large part of the American audience won't be familiar with the source material. And there's like a sliding scale here when we're talking about this, because it's such a thorny subject for us, right? Because sometimes we say, well, maybe we're going to write for a smaller audience. Maybe we're going to make that decision that we're writing this for people who know this source material, and that's okay. So, and it's just going to be accessible to these people, and we are sacrificing, the accessibility of this, the wider audience. But a lot of the time we don't want to do that. A lot of the time we really do want to make things accessible to wider US based audiences. And then the question becomes, how can we do that? And then also not be over explaining the cultural elements to people who know them, because that makes it then not as fun an experience for the people who are coming from where we're coming from, where we want to write from. So it's very much a balancing act, and there's I could write thousands of words of essays on like this long conversations we go through on making these decisions, because there's there's a lot of emotional baggage that comes along with it when it's one of these types of things we're talking about. So it is an ongoing struggle to sort of balance those, and it always feels like writing on two levels. John Chu wrote this great essay on integrating non-English languages into fiction, and how difficult that is, and how you have to write it so the story works on both levels, for people who understand the non-English language and for people who don't, and that they're both getting an amazing complete story, but it's slightly different for both audiences. I kind of feel like it's a parallel situation when adapting from a source material, that maybe you're going into it knowing that a lot of people won't know it, but you also still want to write to the people who do.
Yeah, I would just say that it's very important to keep hold of your assumptions and to be aware of them. Like, it's really easy to write a remix or an adaptation of something that you're super familiar with, and then, whoops, I baked in assumptions that everyone would just know that Captain Hook does this, right? Like, no, turning it on its head doesn't work if you don't know what its head was, right, to begin with. So it's hard to do, but it is really important to keep in mind. And eventually, you do have to make a choice, and sometimes that choice can be painful, where you go, okay, I need to write this way. It's not going to be accessible to people who don't know it. If I write it this other way, it's going to be 6 times the length or whatever, right? It just doesn't work. So it is hard, but it teaches you about what your assumptions are really quickly, and it's good practice to keep in mind who knows what.
Okay, yeah, real quick, we got about 3 minutes left, it looks like. We have another question from Alex. Are there some visual media that it's easier or harder to adapt textual media to, or vice versa? What about the adapted work makes the adapted to medium easier or harder? Real quick, if you're adapting from text to visual media, it helps if you're working with a text that has really good visual descriptions.
And honestly, a lot of action. You know, what you were saying about the Hunger Games. You know, when you have a book that has a lot of internal stuff, like the main character just thinking about things, that's cool to read on the page, but like, how do you translate that? And it is hard to do well, but possible. You know, if you choose the right thoughts to translate into action and the right interactions to add to show those same sorts of emotions.
I think the ones that are hardest might be ones that sort of depend on the medium they're in more, or at least make use of that medium very strongly for the reader experience. Like, this is maybe a more minor example because I don't think necessarily his books depend on this, but the footnotes in Terry Pratchett might be an example of this, where like he's using the written medium in a way that like there's no way to get that into a movie in the same way. Like you'd have to figure out some way of capturing that. And one book to movie adaptation that I think does that really well is The Princess Bride, which the movie was written by the author of the book, so it makes sense. But the adaptation of the metafiction parts, where like he's interjecting his real life in between in the book, they adapted incredibly well in the movie, and it's not done the same way, but it captures it. And they very easily could have just left that out and it would not have been nearly the movie it was, but they did manage to figure out a way to do that. So, but and it's cool to see, as like we're talking about adaptation art forms.
I can't believe I didn't mention that earlier. I love that movie so much.
Okay.
Yeah, that's my favorite book. So I forgot it. What the heck?
Okay, looks like we are at the end of our panel. So thank you so much to the panelists and to our organizer, Tiffany, and Dream Foundry and FITSA Foundry for organizing everything. That's been fun.
Thank you, everybody in the audience, for coming and
thank you to our,
asking questions.
To our audience members and those who had questions and those who didn't have questions.